Welcome to the House of Truth. Today, today we're resuming our series on after Joshua. Last time we talked about Caleb and how faithful he was, and we had some contrast. In doing so, there was a contrast between him and, well, of course, most of the generation in the wilderness that generation that died in the wilderness. Only him and Joshua escaped, but he was just consistently faithful to the end, and how he effectively became judge after Joshua. It doesn't, this title's not applied to him, but the title wouldn't apply to Joshua per se either. But Moses was judge, and and Jethro, and under the advice of Jethro, it set up a set of sub judges, and it was codified in the Torah that there needed to be a judge to keep that doing that function Moses did, to take the hard cases and instruct them in how to keep the law of God properly. Every generation until a king, every generation until a king arose, and then then the judge wouldn't he'd take over that function as well between the people as the king. So, there's very many differences. Moses wasn't paid. The judges didn't have a palace, except so. But they did serve in the function of leading the army often. It's the head of the army. So so they went. That was so Caleb was there, but we saw this kind of pattern of other people. They weren't like that generation of the wilderness, but they weren't. There was some indications they weren't quite as faithful as Caleb. Caleb had went in there and even though 7 years had passed by since he was 85 and said he was as strong as he'd been, he still went there and took possession of the land, and and drove out the three sons of Anak. He couldn't kill them, but he couldn't kill them. But he drove them out of the walled city in the tribe of Judah, and set up a test for to see who should pass on. Promise, marry. He'll give his daughter to this person who would take this other city, which neither one was for him. They were Levitical city, one for the priest, and so he wasn't just I got mine, you're on your own. He took care of them as well, and of course that kept the Canaanites in those areas invading. And it's a model of what God intended for the rest of the people. But Joshua had said to him, "Why are you slack? Why are you not doing this?" Joshua, if you remember, had basically a large L-shaped swath of land. He said much land remained, was true. He took about 1/6 of it, but he made a nice, he took about as much as it was on the eastern Jordan, in the eastern Promised Land. His part was almost maybe the same size, just a lot more over on there left to be taken over. But basically went 10, 20 miles wide at the most, going north and south, went across all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, a region that big, and then when they went from east to west, the Jordan River west, maybe as much as 20 miles, following the Jordan River, and left quite a bit. But what it did was it divide the northern Canaanites from the southern Canaanites, and now they could expand westward to take land, northward to take that land, or southward. Okay, and take southward, but they didn't have all the land. Joshua said it. And they weren't, and we're going to look at some reasons why they didn't. But one of them that he indicated was they were lazy. And we're going to look at this and talk about the plan that God had, how they were supposed to go about it, and what they did and didn't do that they should, where they succeeded and where they failed after Joshua, particularly after he died. And here's what we read. So we're going to begin with a little foundation to start setting up what they're supposed to be doing that Caleb did so well. He did it exactly right. And here we begin here in Exodus 33, 1 through 2, and we read the following. And the Lord says, "Depart and go up from here, you and your people, which you brought out of the land of Egypt, into the land I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, saying, unto your seed I will give it. And I will send an angel before you, and I'll drive out the Canaanite, the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. For some reason, the Girgasites are missing in this particular list, but well, draw the main thing is we mentioned before who's missing is the Philistines because they're not Canaanites. These are these. This is the main ethnic group. These other ones came out were sub ethnic groups, and this one came out of it. Okay, we talked about that before, but the Philistines were actually related to the Egyptians. Came up, what's the misnamed Sinai Peninsula today, a place called Camptor, because they tried to overthrow the king of Egypt, and then they came from Camptor up there and took along the coast there, the Mediterranean coast. Basically, roughly what's a little bit long Gaza Strip today, just a little bit longer further up the coast than the current Gaza Strip. But they're never listed in this drive out business. Their names literally mean invaders. But notice drive out. Well, remember and we talked about we'd shown out before that. So that shows they had an option. In some cases, it said they annihilated, whether it was they drove them out. The Canaanites who were there really had three options. We'll talk about the third one later. Very few took it, but it was stay, fight, and be destroyed, or leave. And the Hittites, particularly the left, the famous Trojans were part of the Hittite. Troy was a Hittite city in the Hittite Empire, as it was called, that occupied about a half of the modern country of Turkey. They left the land and thrived elsewhere. But they were driven out of the land. It wasn't voluntary, but they did leave. They chose resettlement over death. So those were kind of the two options we're talking about here. And there's a third option we'll look at that was very rarely taken. Now, in Deuteronomy 4:37-38, read the following. Because he loved your fathers, therefore he chose your seed after him, brought you out of his sight with his mighty power out of Egypt, to drive out nations before you, greater and mightier than you are, to bring you in, to give you their land for an inheritance as it is today. Okay, we see the same thing. Not because of them, because he made a covenant with their fathers. And this covenant, they weren't born, but they made a covenant with all three of these. They had something they had to do, and they did it. Now he's going to fulfill his. Notice he's going to send that angel, the angel of the Lord, Melech Adonai, and by him he's going to drive out these Canaanites. And remember, this angel is doing all the heavy lifting. It is impossible for them to take out these nations on their own. As we discussed, for the people were bigger, they were stronger, they were more numerous. Each nation, it says, was bigger, had more people than the nation of Israel, and they were outnumbered 7 nations to 1. But this angel makes it possible. That's why it says he's going to do the driving out. And see, there it is, greater and mightier than you, but his mighty power out of Egypt. That same one, he's going to display. That same one who delivered them from Egypt, where they could not escape, would give them this land. However, they have a part to do in it, and they have to do their and this. There are no unconditional promises in the Bible. You can think of every promise a small covenant. There is a condition. If you do this, I'll do that for you. If you do this for me, God says, I'll do that for you. Every single promise in the Word of God is like that. And this, and these promises we looked at are like that as well. Israel has to do their part. So Moses is saying, to get this part, get all this good stuff you want, the Mecca and I driving them out and you get in the land and so on and so forth. Here's what you got to do. Keep therefore in Deuteronomy 9, verses 9 to 13 again. Keep therefore the words of this covenant and do them that you may prosper in all you do. You shall stand this day, all of you, before the Lord your God, your captains, your tribes, your elders, your officers, with the men of Israel. The little ones, your wives, the strangers in your camp, from the hewer of the wood and to the drawer of your water. You should enter into a covenant with the Lord your God to do into his oath, which the Lord your God makes with you this day, that he may establish you today for a people unto himself, that he may be unto you a God, as he said unto you. And he has sworn unto your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. Okay, notice a people, a people. But notice who this people consist of: the men of Israel and the stranger. The stranger is a ger, a ger, a ger, and a ger is a Gentile, or literally a ger is just anyone that doesn't belong. If I go to another country, I'm a stranger there. I'm a ger to them. Well, in this context, in the context of the Bible, though, it usually means a Gentile who's not living among Gentiles, but living among the people of Israel. That's the men of Israel. But this covenant is still with them. And notice, from the hewer of the wood to the drawer of the water, it's kind of considered the low end of society. This covenant wasn't just for the native, the natural born descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but also included their wives, the little ones, their children, but even Gentiles that lived among them. And remember, from Exodus 12, if they got circumcised, and if they got circumcised and were living there among them, then they would be considered as if they were native born. So these are ones who aren't circumcised, obviously. And there was a lot of customs of the law that those who were circumcised had to keep no matter where they lived, even if they got scattered later. But as long as these strangers were living in the land of Israel, they also had to keep many of those customs. They had to get circumcised, for example, and there were a few others we've looked at before they didn't have to do. They could eat, I believe, if I remember, as animals that died of themselves could be given to the stranger to eat, you know. But those who've been circumcised could not eat it. They couldn't eat the lamb at Passover. You know, but most of them most of those customs they had to keep anyway, not because God is trying to assimilate like the Borg, you will be assimilated, every Gentile, but because they lived among the Jewish people, to not be a distraction from not to be a distraction from the Jewish people from keeping these customs. Okay, not to be a hindrance, I perhaps should say. Nonetheless, it applied to them. And notice, I want to draw your attention again to this particular group, the hewer of the wood and the drawer of the water. We'll talk about later why that's important. So angel of the Lord's going to go before you. I'm going to give you the land I swore, but you have to keep. Here's your part of the deal: keep my commandments, and you got to do them. And it applies to everyone. No one's exempt. You know, the commandments that apply to them, and particularly in the context we're talking about today, the commandments about how to go about taking occupation, possession of the land. Now, in Deuteronomy 11, verses 22 through 24, we're going to start getting some details about these things they have to do as well, and some details about how they're to go about possessing the land. For if you diligently keep all these commandments which command you, to do them, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to cleave to him, then the Lord will drive out these nations from before you, and you shall possess greater and mightier nations than yourself. Every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours. For the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river and the river to the river Euphrates, even to the utmost sea shall be your coast. Okay, we looked at this before. I mean, so notice the Lord will drive out these nations from before you. You're going to possess them. They're greater and mighty yourself. Why? You can't do it on your own. The Lord, the Malachi and I, the angel of the Lord, is going to do the heavy lifting. And you're going to have your part to do as well. But He's going to do the heavy lifting for you. But what is your part in this right now at this point here? It's to keep all the commandments, to do them, and mostly to love the Lord your God. Because you love Him, you're going to obey Him. If you love Him, you're going to walk in all of His ways. You're going to want to walk in all of His ways. You're going to cleave to Him. You're going to want to be near Him. The promise of God is draw nigh, draw near to Him, and He'll draw near to you. But He also says, if you treat me with casualness, don't have time for me, I'll treat you with casualness. But if you love Him, you're going to want to spend time with Him. So they would do that, the meditate on His word and so on and so forth. Then the Lord's going to go in before you and do what you cannot do for yourself. And you're going to do this in this area. Notice this area we talked about. We don't have to speculate where it is, or where it is. Some people have come up with all kinds of crazy things. Ezekiel gives us exactly the boundaries. We looked in the previous lesson. We looked at the previous lesson of the map. Some of the cities aren't known, but it was fairly close. And what we found was, it's about the size of the state of Kentucky. And if you kind of in your mind can flip Kentucky upside down, and then no, not flip her upside down, kind of rotate Kentucky, rotate the state of Kentucky clockwise, and then flip it over. It's almost the same, that shape as well, interestingly enough. Very similar shape to the state of Kentucky as well as the size. So he's going to. So this is what he's going to drive out. That's what he's going to drive. But it's not going to be. It's going to be something they can do. He's going to do all the heavy lifting. Their parts to obey Him again, and this again is His land. And Joshua 3, 9 through 10, read the following. Joshua said to the children of Israel, come here and hear the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, hereby you shall know that the living God is among you. He will not fail to drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgasites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. So, now there's the Girgasites who weren't there earlier. 7, as it said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But what is their part for him to do that he's not going to fail? He'll get every one of them out of them. He'll work with them to get every one of these all these people out of them. Remember that his thing is so they don't draw you into idolatry. Their part's to come and hear the words of the Lord. Okay, not to the spies to manna, as we talked about. We were talking about Messiah. They despised the manna. They despised him because of the word he spoke that they got from his father. Not to despise the manna, but to love it, delight in it, and he would take care. He would do this for them. Joshua has been passed the torch, and he's reminding him of this. Now we're going to go to Joshua 13, verse 3 through 6. This is after Joshua's done after 7 years of war and conquest that started at Jericho, and he's dividing the land. Okay, and here's some of the description of the land that's being divided. And notice what he says is going to be done. Because remember, they're not all driven out yet. From Sihor, which is before Egypt, under the borders of Ekron northward, is counted to the Canaanite, five lords of the Philistines, the the Gezerites, the Gezerites, the Ashdodites, the Ashkelonites, the Gittites, and the Ekronites, also the Ivites. And to the south, all the land, all the Canaanites, Nerea, which is beside the Sidonians unto Aphek, to the borders of the Amorites, and the land of the Gibeonites, and all of Lebanon towards the sun rising, from Baal God, Baal, excuse me there, again, from Baal God under Mount Hermon, and to the entering of Hamath, and all the inhabitants of the hill country from from Lebanon unto Metzrethrim, Maim, and all the Sidonians, them I will drive out before the children of Israel. Only divide you by the lot the children of Israel for a inheritance, as I've said today. Okay. I remember Hamath is the entering of, the gates of, the border of, and that was the city of Homs the day but that province is still called Hamath. The area is still called that to this day. So just and that's a little north of Damascus. You kind of draw a line straight. And if you look, and we looked on the showed on the map, it's kind of a line that goes your Lebanon anti Lebanon range where Mount Hermon is kind of comes in. It's across the top of that, and then kind of over jagged over and basically covers. It's about roughly the half of the current country of Syria. Okay, and we're talking about the southern half, where interestingly Israel is now occupying today because of the terrorists who took over the country from another brutal dictator, to be quite honest. The big losers in all this was the Syrian people. Anyways, moving along here. This is Sidon, Lebanon, all the country of Lebanon. Notice, I will drive them out. They're not all been driven out, but you're to go ahead and divide it for them as I commanded you. Okay, and again, that gives some responsibility of this part belongs to you, that part belongs to this part belongs to this tribe, and this tribe to do this, and that part belongs to that tribe. It's members of that tribe's responsibility to do this rolling out process of taking over the land, which we'll talk about more details, the details of that. So the driving out wasn't finished. The Manasseh and I didn't stop with Joshua. The plan was for the Manasseh and I to continue to do this until the entire promised land was taken possession of. But the plan was never to do it all quickly. As I mentioned, kind of a right angle shaped piece of land that Joshua took, that with one going up bordering the Jordan River, and on the other side was the eastern promised land where the tribes over there had. So they could expand eastward, westward that way, and then this strip that ran east to west all the way from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, where they could expand southward or northward from there as well. And parts of most of the tribes, if not all of them's land, they had some piece in the strip, almost all of them. There's one tribe that I think it's Zebulun, perhaps did not, but no, not Zebulun. I'm sorry, but yeah, but most of them had a little piece. Had some of that some of their inheritance was already been cleared, but certainly not all the land. And here's why. In Exodus 23, 29 to 31. I will drive them out before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate, The field of the beasts of the field multiply against you. By little and little I'll drive them out before you, until you be increased and inherit the land. I'll set your bounds from the Red Sea unto the sea of the Philistines, from the desert to the river. I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and shall drive them out before you. Okay, so notice this plan. Not in one year. In fact, it's little by little, it's generation after generation. I mean, he's done doing it with Joshua, but he's promising to continue. So the Amalekites continue to do what the levy lifting they can't take care of themselves as long as they keep doing their part. Now, what is part of their part is kind of hinted right here. Why? Lest the land become desolate, empty. Well, if they don't go, yeah, okay, they drove these guys out, but they have these empty farms. I could play with farmhouses and farm buildings for the animals, crops that haven't been harvested, but they don't go in there and start living in them and harvest the crop. The land's desolate, and what's going to happen? The feasts of the field are going to multiply, and when it's about beasts, not something you'd want to go hunt like deer or antelope. It's particularly referring to, especially certain predators. The Bible mentions over and over again: leopards, bears, wolves, and lions. And we know, and we also know even from history, even relatively recent, as late as 1870, there were also crocodiles, hippopotamus, and rhinoceros, all which can kill you. And perhaps some variety of elephant, perhaps the North African elephant was there as well. It's an extinct variety today. The problem is, but particularly those predator animals kill your children and your livestock and adult men if they're perhaps as well, who may or may not succeed in fighting them off. Well, that's no good. So the plan here is, why is year by year, is they're supposed to be occupying the land so it doesn't become desolate. These beasts don't multiply against them, and occupy those cities as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. So he's going to. So the plan here is you're going to go in there. We're going to keep that population density strong, dense enough, thick enough. Wait for their generation. So there's more. They're growing in numbers each generation. They're not barely having 2.2 kids or on average or whatever it is it takes you just to sustain. They're having families 10, 12, whatever, and now they have another group who's ready to go repeat the process. Okay, so as more land's cleared, they occupy it. These things don't return, and they and when they do their little bit, when they do their fighting, just like Joshua and his guys did for 7 years, then they got the rest of the time to stay on the farm it, enjoy it, etc. To the next generation, the next round of possessing more land. As they get people to settle it. It's not enough to just drive other people out of it. They've got to settle it, or it'll create a vacuum and something will move into it. The beasts of the field, or other people, or both. So we continue here in Leviticus 26:6. He brings this up again, and stress to the reason for this. I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, none shall make you afraid. For I will rid evil beasts out of the land, there shall the sword go through your land. Okay, notice there's another aspect here. I mean, today in Israel, they don't have peace and security. None's going to make you afraid. They got alarms. They got, short time when they hear that alarm to get out and get in the bomb shelter. Perhaps after a while, people get used to it because people do these things. But still, there's someone to make them afraid. There's an Amas except. It's not as though the beasts, I said. Notice the sword, human beings. I'm going to give you peace if you just stick with this plan. And not only keep these beasts from returning, and again, evil not meaning they got any kind of moral character, but talking about evil as in like the term of troublesome, dangerous. Okay, well, there's also these other dangerous beasts. These other people, these Canaanites, go through your land. Well, they're not going to do it when they're afraid. They know if they attack, these people these areas are densely populated, and they're going to come in there. They're going to come together and they're blow the shofar, and that's going to sound going to that sound. They'll just keep repeating that echo. One guy hears it, they'll blow it and transfer it to the next, and they'll just cover the whole land, and they'll all come to this one spot. Come where the invaders are, however many it takes, and they'll wipe them off the face of the earth, so the invaders just won't come in. If they'll just stick this plan to occupy the farmland and the cities with sufficient population density, not just keep fighting. To get more land they cannot possess. Now, in Deuteronomy 7:22 through 20, read the following. 24, read the following. And the Lord said, I'll put out those nations before you, little by little, that you consume them not at once, lest the big feast of the field increase upon you. And for the Lord your God shall deliver them unto you, and shall destroy them with a mighty destruction until they be destroyed. He shall deliver their kings into your hand, and you shall destroy their name from under heaven. There shall no man be able to stand before you until you have destroyed them. Or remember, we saw this in Joshua. The Melech Adonai didn't kill a single king. How he delivered them? He delivered them into their hands. Well, without their army, they're not going to, they're not so tough, And who knows? Perhaps they in sort of battle, but they get delivered and killed and hung to show they're under the curse of God. Why? Because this idolatry, this idol worship. That's a message to Israel too. Don't do what they did. Don't be worshiping false gods. And this process is going to continue until they've all been destroyed. So this is the plan. Melech and I can handle what you can't. You come along, and he's going to leave you to handle what you can handle. And then you occupy those places. You possess them. You start living in them. You keep that population density high, so that other beasts, we're talking about people, wicked people, or dangerous animals, don't move back into the land, and don't move back into the land. So the land's literally divided during its process between that which has been cleansed from that which has not been cleansed. The clean and the unclean are separated, with the unclean land being cleaned as we go along, generation after generation. That's the plan. And that's why this plan's there. Now, Caleb, as we talked about, was very faithful. He went to his area. He set up farms and everything. There were Canaanite cities that weren't his. Cities that still had Canaanites in them. But in that area that were for the priests and Levites to live in. And he went there and wiped them out for them. Or at least and offered his daughter for the second one, but cleaned them out, and then, so those cities would then be occupied, and Canaanites could move back into those cities. He was the model of how to do it right. He was the one that did it right. Well, now we're going to look at the rest of Israel, and we looked at some of this before a little bit. We're going to look again and compare them, these tribe by tribe basis, as it were, to how well they stuck to the plan. How obedient were they? He was 100%. But let's read about some of these others. in the wilderness of Beth Araba, Medine, Sekath, Sekakoth, and Nibshah, and the city of Salt, and En Gedi, 6 cities with their villages. As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. The Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day. Okay, remember Jerusalem, Judah's border went right to the south side of Jerusalem. That suburb around Jerusalem, that's where their border ended. Up to about up to was about roughly a kilometer, 5/8 of a mile around the city was this green zone. This says suburb of King James. They don't think of a bunch of houses. It's this green zone for livestock, etc. Okay. They went right to that green zone. The problem, of course, why they're interested is twofold. This other tribe may not be able to strong to take these Jebusites out. And secondly, these Jebusites can leave there, raid them, go back into this stronghold. Okay. And if they just say, up, we stop at the border, that's Benjamin's problem. Okay. But notice they could not drive them out. And whether they weren't willing to, they could not. Well, why? The Melech Adonai, it required the help of the Melech Adonai to do so. And these were left there on purpose at this time. And if you recall, we saw later later they come along and destroy them and wipe them out. But that creates another problem we'll look at later. Okay, we'll talk about in a few minutes here. Now, in Judges 1-3, we were going to read about not just Judah, but Simeon as well. Because remember, Simeon's inheritance, bearing the iniquity of their ancestors, this punishment to be scattered, was to have cities and with the suburbs and the villages that ringed those suburbs. So be more like the green zone, which you may think of as suburbs. But all that farmland in between these places belonged to Judah. So again, we saw a little shaded area, purple or whatever, but it wasn't like that. It's like little dots, okay, little polka dots of Simeon's property, but they're all inside the land of Judah. So he says, "Hey, you come." So here's what he said: "You come to me." And Judah said to Simeon's brother, "Come with me, we fight the Canaanites, and I'll likewise go with you to lie." So Simeon went with him. So now Simeon has come in, and them and Judah are going to work together to fight. And that gets rid of these Canaanite cities from coming out and raiding Judah's land. Be a little smarter here than they were. Raiding Judah's land, and it also, of course, helps Simeon get rid of these groups, and Judah gets some help on there as well. So it's a good deal for both. It's a win-win, but it's really Judah being a leader and looking out for his brother, as much as anything. Well, in Judges 1:17-19, we read about how this works out for him. And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they slew the Canaanites that inhabited Zaphath, and utterly destroyed it. And the city of that name was called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza unto the coast thereof, and Ashkelon to the coast thereof, and Ekron with the coast thereof. And the Lord was with Judah. And he brake out the inhabitants of the mountain. And he brake out the inhabitants, drove out, which we say today, it says drove out the inhabitants of the mountains, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron. All right, notice here, they took so far 100% here for them in this regard here. Okay, they slew these Canaanites. They did what they could. They took Gaza, that Philistine city, Ashkelon, the other one, Ekron, the other one. Got 3 of the Philistine cities as well. that remember they're invaders, okay? And there were Canaanites living in them. And if you remember to Gath, which is not mentioned here, is where the last of the Anak, the sons of Anak had went to. Okay. The last of the descendants of the giants went to Gath. Well, they didn't get they weren't able to take they didn't even try to get Gath. And notice well, how they were able to do this is what? The Lord was with them. Okay, he was with them. That's why they're able to take these cities. Okay. But notice they couldn't drive out the inhabitants of the valley. Well, why? The Lord was with them. Why couldn't they do it? Because the Lord wasn't with them in doing this. The Lord was leaving these, these for later. As we saw, he said he would do, not drive them out all in 1 year. Why? So they could occupy the mountains first. Now, why would they want to occupy the mountains first? The high ground. It's more defendable. The Romans had superior technology and everything to the Scot. Well, it became the Scots later. They weren't called that, but the Caledonians and the Picts became Scots later. And they took all of what was Scotland except the Highlands. They never could take the Highlands because that advantage, it was just too costly in terms of men. It would have been a long, drawn out thing. And they kept, they kept getting recalled to go fight other places in the empire as well. They wouldn't, they didn't have the manpower and the time to do it because they were the Highlands. But they took the entire coast and all the farmland of Scotland, but couldn't take the mountain. So this is why the Lords have to take the mountain first. But it's not time to do this, so they can't do it on their own without his help, and he's not doing it. Okay, so everything's good with them, really 100%. They did everything they're supposed to do. The places where he wasn't with them, they couldn't take them. That's all good. But now we're going to get into a problem with the next set of tribes we look at. We're going to start seeing some problems. And here's where we begin in Joshua 17, verse 11 to 12. Manasseh had Issachar and in Issachar and in Asher, Beth Sheans and her towns, Ibleam and her towns, the inhabitants of Dor and her towns, the inhabitants of Endor and her towns, the inhabitants of Taanach and her towns, the inhabitants of Megiddo and her towns, even 3 countries. Yet all the children of Israel of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land. Okay, so what's it saying? Some of the countries, the farmlands around these towns they went and took. But the problem is it's not theirs. They're really taking possession of their own land. They're going to be settling their own land, given that population density. And remember, most of their land had already been conquered under Joshua. I mean, quite honestly, a good chunk of it had already been conquered, by the whole army of Israel. But they got in this mode where they liked the fighting. Settling down meant doing farm work, or if there was in a city, rebuilding the walls that they damaged and maintain the city, and and so on and so forth. And it just wasn't as exciting as going to war. Okay, so they go in there and they take these lands, they take what they can manage that, but they can't manage these cities. And the Malekah, they were supposed to be over there in these other people's Asher and Issachar themselves are 2 other tribes. They're not in they're not in their own land to begin with. Okay, Issachar, yeah, Zebulun, I may not have any land. Issachar is the one that most likely did and had that northwest section, or northwest section. Okay, so that Joshua may not have conquered any of theirs, but it didn't matter. They went there and it was easy, and it was more. They had been fighting at war for 7 years previously. Then they stopped with Joshua and stuff, and but they found it. Farm life's boring. Whatever. They went and did this, and they weren't because it was about them going on with the fighting, and they even intended they even start settling there, but it wasn't like they didn't have enough land. It was all done proportionally. They had plenty. It was just easier and more exciting than doing what they were supposed to be doing. It's so sort of a laziness factor involved as well. As again, as Joshua had said, why are you slack? Why are you being lazy? But they couldn't do it in the cities because why? They could only do it with the help of the Amalek Adonai. And he wasn't helping them on this project. They were not following the instructions. Now, let's go to Judges 1, verse 27. Continue, a little summary here about Manasseh again. Near Manasseh drive the inhabitants of Beth-shean and her towns, and Tanakh and her towns, and the inhabitants of Dor and her towns, the inhabitants of Ibleam, no, sorry, Ibleam and her towns, but the inhabitants of Megiddo and her towns, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land. Okay, notice before, they're going to dwell in that land, but they're in the cities. They're actually end up getting out in the farmland as well later, okay? I mean, and why could they? Because they weren't following the plan. They're supposed to be over there in the first place. Now, going on about the other large tribe, Judah being one, Ephraim being the other, we read the following. Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer. The Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them. Okay, notice Gezer. Well, now we're talking like so that was Manasseh earlier. Manasseh is one of the double portion. They already had plenty of land over on the east side, and on the west side of the land, they went way over by the coast. Who knows? They liked the land better, whatever. They were definitely not following their instructions. Well, their other tribe that came from Joseph, Ephraim. Notice the can neither did they drive out the Canaanites that dwelled in Gezer. Not a problem necessarily. Perhaps weren't strong enough without the help of the Amalek Adonai. But notice that they continued that they dwelt in Gezer among them. Okay, so they got these Canaanites in there. That were not driven out. Maybe perhaps they couldn't drive without with the help of the Amalek Adonai. That's possible because we saw he wouldn't do it year by year. We already saw where there's some cities where he didn't. Okay, and there's another reason for all this that we'll look at in our next lesson beyond the whole part about making safe population security and security from having population density to keep out the wild animals and people coming in and occupying the cities because you're in occupying the cities, returning. There's another reason as well, an even deeper reason we'll look at next week. Now, in Judges 1 through 21, we've read about the two main, Joseph and Judah, the two largest ones. And now we're going to read about Benjamin and some of these other smaller tribes. We've already looked at some of them to some degree, how someone else came and took over what they're supposed to be perhaps arguably their job to do that they weren't doing. Again, laziness. But let's read about Benjamin here in Judges 1, verse 21. The children of Benjamin did not drive the Jebusites from that inhabited Jerusalem. The Jebusites dwell with the children of Jerusalem unto this day. Remember earlier I said that with Judah. Well, remember, Jerusalem's actually in Benjamin's territory, but just a kilometer away, roughly, 5/8 of a mile for us, American standard, using imperial measurements as they're called. It's Judah's land. Now, if you remember, Judah did destroy them later. Well, what's the problem here? It's over in the land and the children of Benjamin let them move back in. Why? Because after Judah did destroy during the same time period here, did destroy the the did destroy Jerusalem, Benjamin didn't go in and occupy it, and the Jebusites moved back in. It's kind of like if like where I grew up, snakes could sometimes get in their house, and sometimes they can move surprisingly fast, and they might get out the door, and you might escape them. Perhaps someone left the door cracked or something, or that. Well, it's like they did that, and then they just left the door open, and the snakes came back in. I mean, this is basically what Benjamin did. They did not follow the plan. And again, a lot of it has to do with laziness. Remember, Benjamin carried between the shoulders, like talking about like a young child being carried in a backpack, like in the backpack thing on the between the shoulders of his father when they went out walking, like perhaps Jesus was, Yahshua was, when they fled to Egypt. He's only a few days, well, actually he was 2 years old, but still um, young enough that maybe perhaps Joseph did that. Same idea over with Benjamin here. And we talked about how his property, as his his possession was the only one that did not board that didn't have a border someone could come that could come to directly. Someone to go through another tribe to attack Benjamin, and he's between the two biggest and strongest tribes. Okay, protected by them, and their territory kind of looked like shoulder blades. Well, so he's got this sense of some people say I'm the baby of the family, but Jacob definitely showed a little bit more. Oh, I can't take Benjamin, anyone but Benjamin, right? When Joseph said, unless you bring the younger brother, you won't see me again. You're not getting more food. Uh, perhaps a little bit of an instilled attitude of use someone else taking care of things for them instead of them taking care of what they could take care of themselves. So and again, their roots back in laziness. So the Jebusites come back in because they were lazy. And we're going to see this how this laziness theme gets even worse in our next lesson and where it ultimately leads to. Now in Joshua 1:31 through 32, read the following about Asher. But neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Zidon, or of Abla, of Avlab, or Akziv, or Elhab, or Afik, or Rehab. But the Canaanites dwell among the Asherites dwell among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Okay, it's implied here this that that these were that this was some of those things that remember when I take care of the heavy lifting, you can't take care of yourself, and your responsibility is to take care of what you can take care of. And it's implied or they could take care of these on their own, or perhaps even the Melech was available for them to take care to help them. Remember he was with Judah. They had asked who should go first, Judah, but they didn't do it. And notice how bad how bad it ended up with them. They are the minority. They dwelt among the Canaanites. They were content to have a little kibbutzes or anyways, I forgot the other one's called. But anyway, little farmlands or their little farm communities or whatever. And or whatever the case was, or perhaps they found some cities and they just liked those and then we'll go out in the farmland. But they were content with being outnumbered, being a minority in the land God had given them. Again, kind of laziness. They're not fulfilling the plan. As we see, there's kind of a regression of as we go down these tribes of pretty much everything right to worse, huh? Now, we end here with Judges in 134. And this one, and this one perhaps would not, perhaps is not a worst case. The Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountain, who were not suffering to come down to the valley. Well, we'd seen that before. We'd seen this same sort of thing before. And remember now, Dan's got the highland, and they can use that later to come down. And it could be simply they could not do it without the help of the Melech Adonai, and he wasn't doing it because the plan was to settle the mountain first. And if you remember we looked at their territory, notice it's the mountain. They really got one to speak of, one mountainous area to speak of. But that's the highland. That's the tough to defend or tough to take for other people, easy to defend property. And so, it's arguable that that the Amorite, the children of Dan, but notice that says forced. It's possible that the children of Dan had went outside where they were supposed to go, because perhaps they just thought it was easier. They didn't like the mountain, whatever, and were forced back into it. But they're not going to come down the valley. And not necessarily a failure of Dan. It made it, I mean, these people are obviously too strong for them, and they cannot do it with the help of the Amalek Adonai. And again, perhaps the whole point was Dan was just settle the mountain first, anyways, and another generation come down and start taking the valley land. So we see this pattern that's gone on and on and on. There's one other area where there's perhaps you have to distinguish between failing to obey the instructions and obeying them. Question is, are they doing are they following the instructions or not? And that's what we're looking at here in this last two sections. It's about covenants. In Exodus 23, 31 through 32, we read the following. I will set you the bounds from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, from the desert to the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land to your hand. You shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenants with them, nor with their gods. Now, the point people often miss is they just stop at pretend there's a period here and this part doesn't exist. But notice the nor with their gods is stressed there. And remember the reason why is so you don't intermarry and they draw you away from God into their idol worship. So it's about they come not just with them, but their gods as well. Okay. It's an important distinction we need to make here. Now, we go to Joshua 2, verse 11 through 14, and we read about them making the covenant with the inhabitants of the land. As soon as we heard these things, our hearts did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. Therefore I pray to you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I've showed you kindness, that you will show kindness unto my father's house and give me a true token. That you will save my father alive, my father, my mother, my brother, and my sisters, and all they have, and deliver our lives from death. And the men answered, our lives for you, if you know not this our business. It shall be when the Lord has given us this land, we will deal triumphantly and truly with you. Okay, make a covenant. We talked about this covenant, in recent times. Now, they have a condition note. They have really three that Rahab has to meet. One's to keep it secret, like the hidden plan of God. One was that scarlet thread. Second was that scarlet thread. I'm missing one. Anyways, but the point here is there's conditions to this. And notice, I swear to me by the Lord. Okay. back to this covenant. You're not going to make covenants with their gods. Well, their gods are called nothings in the Bible. There's nothing to them. They're just something. Someone's. It's talking about swearing in the name of their gods. How you make a covenant with their God. Okay, so they make a covenant, but notice she she is not is she has cast off idolatry. He is God in heaven above and heaven on earth. She's saying he's the only God there is. This is a covenant with that God, by that God. Not a covenant with an idol. She says, swear to me by Baal or whatever is an idol, but with the Lord God. Okay. So this covenant has these conditions. And if she meets them, we're going to live. Oh, of course, they had to stay in the house. Okay. They have to stay in the house. They have to stay in the house as well. They have to meet all those conditions. But if they do, the covenant's on. It's a covenant with God ultimately. Our lives for yours, just like our covenant with Messiah, his life for our lives. Now, in Joshua 9, verse 20 through 26, read the following. And they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told your servants how the Lord God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore, we were sore afraid of our lives because you have done this thing. Behold, we are in your hand. Do as it seems good and right to you. Do unto us to do. So he did to them, delivered them out of the hand of the children of Israel. They slew them not. Okay. Well, what was it they had done? They had made a covenant with them. Why? Again, notice fears of God. And that covenant was sworn by the Lord. That covenant was a covenant with God for their salvation. And they had to humble themselves. It had conditions. They humbled themselves. We'll look at that and exactly what I mean by that in a moment. But they also had conditions and they had to keep them. But the covenant wasn't with a foreign God, with an idol God, a nothing. It was with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That other option that could have been taken. Both of them came. I mean, both of them came. Well, we'll look at that. What they do afterwards shows their attitude of total surrender. That they are surrendering not just to Israel, but to God completely. And here's what we see in Joshua 6:25 that shows that. Joshua saved Rahab the heart of the lie and their father's household in all she had, and she dwells in Israel even unto this day, because she hid the messengers which God sent to spy out Jericho. Okay. She kept her end. So she did this. Remember, it says by faith she kept her in. There was no salvation without works. She kept her faith without works is dead. God never promised by faith alone, just I believe it. Well, I believe it. I believe in my heart, and just going about your business. You have to show the works that show that your faith is genuine. God has set conditions, and you have to meet them. Well, that's what's happened here with her. And what happened? She dwells with Israel. Remember, we talked about the Ger who lives among them has to keep all those customs. And eventually, perhaps her descendants, well, we know some because we know who they are. In fact, her own son got circumcised. She married an Israeli man. Her son got circumcised. It was counted as if they're the people of Israel, absorbed into Israel, a worshiper of the God of Israel, not trying to draw them away from God to these idols that she was sick of. She was a harlot, remember? And it's brought up here. That I mean, you can think of her maybe as a like, think of it more in modern terms like sex trafficking, like she'd been sex trafficked to bring worship to this god. Okay, these false gods, not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but to Baal and so on and so forth. She hated that. She hated that system. She hated those gods. She wanted to serve the living God. And remember God's promise: "You draw near to me, I'll draw near to you." She drew near to God, and He drew near to her. He brought her in because she wasn't trying to drag them away to their God. In turn, she turned to the living God. And because she repented, God relented, as He did with Israel many times. He's no respecter of persons. Now, in Deuteronomy 9:27, read the following. And Joshua made them hewers of that day, hewers of wood, and drawers of wire for the congregation, and for the altar of the Lord, even to this day, in the place which He should choose. Remember, we talked about lowest members of society. Now, what are they? They're Gentiles living among the people of Israel. And they're even the lowest society, but remember that covenant is still even with them. They've entered into that covenant with God. They were not trying to drag them into the idolatry. They recognized the uselessness of their idols and abandoned them. God is not looking to destroy the wicked, but he will when the wicked will not repent. He 1,000 times he'd rather do them. It's like Messiah not come to destroy people, but to save them. But if they refuse His word, He says that word will work against them and bring their destruction. If they reject His word because they're rejecting the one that sent Him. God takes no pleasure in the righteousness and the destruction of the wicked, the Bible tells us. He's not willing any should perish, but all should come to salvation. That applied to these Gentiles too, who later are still distinguished from Israel as the Nethinim. And the thing about the Nethinim is they were loyal to God when most of Israel wasn't. They may have the ancestry and the DNA of Gentiles, but they had the heart of a true Jew. But there's another covenant group. So they get this precedence now going on at the time of Judges of we can make covenants with Gentiles. We'll not try to get us drag them to their gods, so on and so forth. But those covenants were in line with the instructions. But let's go look at this next covenant that's being made and see how it stacks up in our last passage. In Judges 1, verse 22 to 26. The house of Joseph, they also went against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph was sent to the scribe Bethel. Now the name before was Luz. And the spies saw the man come out, the scribe, come forth out of the city. They said to him, Sir, we pray you, the entrance into the city, and we will show you mercy. Now he showed them the entrance of the city. They smote the city with the edge of the sword. They let the man go and all his family. The man went into the land of the Hittites and built the city and called the name thereof Luz, which is the name thereof to this day. Okay, so Bethel is near where Jacob had that vision of the ladder, the house of God, was still being called Luz. Now, notice everything's different on this. They went up there. They were sent to the spies. Okay, they went there, and remember we talked to the spies that went to Jericho. Were also referred to as messengers, perhaps bringing a message of peace that kept being rejected, as we saw. Okay, and as a rejected, as we saw, like God doing the east side of the Jordan with the kings. With Sihon. Man, Sihon rejected, and then they were totally destroyed. Well, they're doing this, and they perhaps think of Rahab and the spy, but notice Notice what's going on. Their lives are not in danger, like those two spies with Rahab. This is laziness. They're supposed to descry is Bethel. So to spy it out, look for its weaknesses, draw maps, whatever. Look for how they're gonna, but they're gonna take a shortcut here. They're having a compromise. Show us this, save us this work, and we'll show you mercy. And notice they propose the covenant, not the other guy. No one is swearing by the name of the Lord. So he takes them up on it. And they kill everyone except this man and his family. Well, notice this man doesn't ever turn to the Lord. He goes to the land of the Hittites. Idol worshippers he kept worshiping idols. And he built a city, calls it by the same name. He built a new city of Luz. Of course, now he's going to be the mayor. Probably the Mech would be a more accurate term, which is like the king of that city. Okay, but there's no repentance involved. There's no coming in a covenant with God. No surrender to God. No saying to the people of Israel, "Hey, we would like peace, and we're in the name we're afraid of your God. We'd like peace." So this is a totally different case, and it's setting things up for a lot of trouble that's been building up. So this laziness is really going to bite them next week. We'll look into that. Yeah, that's what's going on. We looked at the instructions, the basic plan: go in, clear out an area, occupy it, take those, keep the population density up. Next generation, when you got more people, repeat process. Really, it's that simple. And Malek Adonai is going to keep going before you, take care of what you can do, and you take care of what you can behind him. Okay. And some part of Israel really followed well. The plan was like Caleb, but a lot of them were they weren't in absolute out rebellion, but out of laziness were looking for shortcuts, or perhaps looking for excitement when they went into someone else's property, wasn't even near theirs, or perhaps they just liked the land better. But they perhaps missed the excitement of war, or heard by this point perhaps heard their fathers talk about it or whatever, or they experienced it themselves and missed the excitement of war and found farm life or city life boring and whatever. That was also possible motivation, but the laziness thing certainly was. We've seen over and over again, and it led to partial obedience. And partial obedience is really disobedience. And this is all gonna come to bite them in our next lesson when we look at. But we'll close with this thought for you. These thoughts. You got to keep the covenant you make with God. And you got to be on guard not to let laziness cause you to look for shortcuts, or just, I think, say in a ministry, I think that other ministry more exciting. This happens all the time. People or pastors, called to be pastors, doing a fine job. Like, man, I'm just in this little town here. I never get to go nowhere. I want to become an evangelist and go off and where they're not supposed to go. The evangelists do the same thing. I'm tired of all this travel. I just want to settle down somewhere, and they start a church. But they weren't supposed to settle down and start a church. Sure, they stay in some place for a while. We sit with Philip, the evangelist. But that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about getting out, and it can apply to your job, a career. People have those midlife crises, and they're in the career God gave them called them to be in already. But that other one looks more exciting. And often they get there and find out, hey, It didn't work out well for them at all. Okay. And go back to their former career sometimes, or sometimes they just really have just messed themselves up completely. Don't do that. Love God and follow him with your whole heart. And whatever he calls you to do it with all your might, stick with it, and don't complain. And know he is going to reward you according to your effort. Well, and you don't want to be rewarded for a bad effort, like we're going to see these people are going to the people of Israel are going to get rewarded for a bad effort in our next lesson. Until then, shalom.